The man in charge of Brexit talks for the EU has signalled that he'll drive a hard bargain. Michel Barnier said negotiations would be fast and there'd be no picking and choosing on issues like the single market.
The single market and its four freedoms are indivisible. Cherry picking is not an option.
People talk about the sort of Brexit that there is going to be. Is it hard, soft? Is it grey, white? Actually, we want a red, white and blue Brexit. That is the right Brexit for the United Kingdom.
We'll bring you more on the first detailed statement of how the EU wants Brexit to happen and reaction from Westminster. Also this lunchtime. Who has the authority to trigger Brexit, MPs or the government? The Supreme Court considers the question for a second day. Queen's Park Rangers becomes the latest club to say it's now investigating allegations of historical sexual abuse. All change on the railways. New government plans to get people who run the trains to work more closely with those who run the tracks. And how do the UK schools compare with classrooms in the rest of the world? We'll have the latest findings.
In the south, as Southern Rail passengers suffer another strike, the Bishop of Chichester calls for an end to the misery, and why drivers in Dorset are fuming over parking charges at local parks.
Good afternoon, welcome to the BBC News at 1. We may not know Britain's negotiating position over the UK's exit from the European Union, but today the man in charge of negotiations for the EU has been setting out his stall with the appeal to keep calm and negotiate. Michel Barnier said the UK had to stage an orderly withdrawal, but the actual negotiating period could be less than 18 months and not the 2 years spoken of in London. He also stressed that countries outside the EU bloc could never have the same rights and benefits as its members. Cherry-picking, he said, was not an option. Richard Galpin reports.
Round one of what's shaping up to be a bruising fight between Britain and the EU over Brexit is now underway. The EU's gloves are off. While the negotiating position of the government here remains distinctly hazy, in Brussels today came a series of short, sharp jabs from the man who'll lead the EU side in the talks, likely to start in the spring.
Being a member of the European Union comes with rights and benefits. Third countries can never have the same rights and benefits, since they are not subject to the same obligations. The single market and its four freedoms are indivisible. Cherry-picking is not an option.
The chief negotiator was also asked about the impact leaving the EU might have on the Northern Ireland peace deal.
Will the common travel area between Britain and Ireland be retained?
He stressed they would do everything to preserve the success of the Good Friday Agreement. Meanwhile, Theresa May was far away from Brussels this morning on a visit to Bahrain, meeting British forces. On Brexit, she indicated there'd be no compromise on the deal she wants for Britain.
We want a red, white and blue Brexit. That is the right Brexit for the United Kingdom, the right deal for the United Kingdom. I'm ambitious for what we can achieve because I believe that a deal that is right for the United Kingdom will also be a deal that is right for the European Union.
For many EU leaders, that apparently hardline approach to the upcoming talks is not acceptable.
It can be smooth and it can be orderly. But it requires a different attitude, I think, on the part of the British government, because I think the things I've been hearing so far are incompatible with smooth and incompatible with orderly.
And the main EU leaders all seem to be hammering home the same message to Britain.
We won't allow cherry-picking. The four basic freedoms have to be upheld. The freedom of movement of people, goods, services and financial services. That's the prerequisite for access to the internal market. This has to be the maxim for our negotiations with the UK.
So the European Union has started punching hard already, a sign of just how tough the negotiations next year are likely to be. Richard Galpin, BBC News.
Well, we can talk now to our Europe correspondent Damien Grammaticus. And Damien, Michel Barnier's first full statement, and he's clearly playing hardball.
Well, I think this is very interesting because I think you get very different views of this. In the UK, it's seen as hardball. Here in Brussels and around European capitals, it's seen as entirely logical. And I think the view here is that the discussion at the minute in the UK, as you heard from the Dutch finance minister there, who's a very important player in this, is that the UK position is muddled and unrealistic, which is why Mr Barnier, I think, was laying out very clearly that there would be no special deals cut for the UK, that the UK could not expect, as you heard him say, to get better terms outside the EU than inside the club. That's simply not on offer to countries that leave. They can't expect that. And that accepting the EU's freedoms, the freedom of movement particularly, is vital if you want full, unfettered access to the single market. And I think all of those things are messages that the EU side have been saying since the referendum. It's a very clear, consistent position, repeated again by Mr Barnier. And he said he was ready for negotiations. He wants them to start as soon as possible.
Thanks, Damien. Well, our assistant political editor Norman Smith is in Westminster for us. Norman, we heard a little earlier from the Prime Minister. Any further reaction from Westminster?
Well, you might think, Rita, that ministers' hackles would rise at what looks like a very Gallic throwing down of the gauntlet, a sort of non to all the key British demands on Brexit. I have to say, in private, ministers actually seem a good deal more relaxed. Why? Well, because they always took the view that Mr Barnier was going to prove a pretty combative chief negotiator, and that this is, if you like, his opening gambit. One minister said to me, Mr Barnier was posturing, he was negotiating in public, and that when it came to the crunch, he would be much more flexible. Why? Because ministers take the view that EU countries have their own Brexit pressures in their own countries. More than that, if Britain is punished, particularly if the city is punished, then that will damage EU economies as well. In other words, despite the tough talk, in the end, the EU will be ready to cut a deal.
Norman, in the meantime, Theresa May is facing a possible rebellion on her own backbenches over Brexit tomorrow.
There is a slight sense, Rita, that while the cat's away, the mice do play, because while Mrs May's in Bahrain, she is facing her possible first Commons defeat over Brexit tomorrow after Labour put down a motion calling on her to publish a document setting out her plans for Brexit amid signs that a hard knot of Tory MPs may back her to defeat the Prime Minister because, frankly, they are fed up with being rebuffed the whole time and told Brexit means Brexit, or we won't give you a running commentary. Will Mrs May compromise? Perhaps not. She fears to do so would undermine her negotiating strategy.
OK, Norman, many thanks. Norman Smith there. Government lawyers have begun a second day of arguments at the Supreme Court in their effort to overturn a High Court decision that ministers would need the approval of MPs to trigger Brexit. James Eadie QC for the government said if ministers lost their appeal, leaving the EU would require new legislation and not just parliamentary involvement. Our political correspondent Ben Wright reports.
The government's legal team arriving at the Supreme Court this morning. Yesterday, they argued ministers did have the power to trigger Britain's exit from the EU without a vote in Parliament. They're trying to overturn a ruling by the High Court last month when lawyers for Gina Miller successfully argued Parliament had to give a green light for Brexit to begin. James Eadie QC, representing the government, continued to make his case to the 11 justices this morning and was pressed on what role Parliament would have during the UK's departure from the EU.
It is, I'm perfectly content to
accept. You've given two diametrically opposed answers in the last 5 minutes to the same question, but we'll obviously have to work out which answer we accept.
Well, maybe...
Unfortunately, we'll have the transcript.
My Lord, let me help you. We do not accept that it is legally irrelevant. But we do accept the point, my Lord, which is you can't proceed on the assumption that Parliament will necessarily legislate to introduce or to pass the Great Repeal Bill, because that depends on what Parliament decides to do.
A key question is whether the law that paved the way for the EU referendum gave the government the power to take Britain out of the EU without a new vote in Parliament.
My case, as you know, is that the 2015 Act in effect involved Parliament deciding to put to the final decision of the people the in-out question. And we do respectfully submit, therefore, that whether it said things or didn't say things, whether it was silent or not, it still carries real constitutional significance, as having been passed at a point in time when they knew full well that the only way of achieving one of the things that, one of the possibilities on the binary question, was to give Article 50 notice.
And that argument is fundamental to the government's case. But James EDQC conceded that if ministers lose this appeal, the government would have to introduce a short bill to Parliament.
If the Supreme Court decides against our arguments here, then the solution in legal terms is a one-line act. Maybe that would lead to all sorts of parliamentary complications and possible additions and amendments and so on, but that's the solution.
This case is also delving into important, politically sensitive questions around devolution. The administrations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland will all make arguments to the court about the role they should have in triggering Brexit. But this morning, the government's advisor on Scottish law insisted that this was a matter solely for Westminster.
The conduct of foreign relations is a matter expressly reserved in the devolution legislation, such that the devolved legislatures have no competence in that matter.
It's why this case is so important constitutionally and politically. It's about how the UK works. This afternoon, the 11 justices will hear the other side of the argument, the case for why Parliament should vote before Brexit begins. Ben Wright, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, let's get the latest now from our legal affairs correspondent, Clive Coleman. So, Clive, the government's just finished its case. How did it close?
Well, Rita, after a day and a half of really complex, detailed legal argument, James EDQC for the government reduced their case down to 4 powerful points. He said that the prerogative powers, the powers the government wants to use to trigger Article 50, are part of our modern constitution, part of the government's powers. He said Parliament knew that in 1972 and it knows it today. He said also that Parliament had regulated some part of the exercise of prerogative powers, but it had done so expressly and it hadn't touched prerogative powers in relation to the triggering of Article 50. And that was quite deliberate, he said. He also said that rights that come into our law as a result of us being in the EU are rights that can be altered by the royal prerogative. And he said that the apparent simplicity of Gina Miller's argument is and I quote, a constitutional trap. He said by applying the broad principle that she argues that an Act of Parliament is needed to trigger Article 50, he said that would take the court over the line. The courts would be imposing new control of a highly controversial kind in the light of the democratic referendum result. That's the government argument. And this afternoon, David Panic for Gina Miller will say that that is completely misconceived.
Clive, thanks very much. Clive Coleman there. And you can watch live coverage from inside the Supreme Court, as well as live text updates and analysis on the BBC News website, and that's at bbc.co.uk/Brexit. Queen's Park Rangers and police in Northern Ireland have now said they're investigating allegations of historical sexual abuse, the latest to be caught up in the crisis engulfing UK football. It means that around 350 people have now alleged they were victims of abuse, and 55 amateur and professional football clubs are linked to the allegations. Our sports correspondent Richard Conway reports.
Queen's Park Rangers are the latest club to be caught up in the child sex abuse scandal engulfing football. In a statement, the club said it has been made aware of the historical allegations made against former club employee Chris Guyler relating to child abuse in football. The club takes these allegations very seriously and will cooperate fully in any forthcoming investigation. The scale of the issue facing football continues to grow. Over 20 police forces across the country are now investigating, with the Police Service of Northern Ireland the latest to start inquiries over historical claims. Separately, 6 former Southampton youth players have made allegations about their former coach, Bob Higgins. Hampshire Police has confirmed an investigation is underway. The Football League sent a letter to every professional English club in 1989, warning them against working with Mr Higgins. He was cleared of sexual abuse charges 3 years later. But in 1997, police and social services sent a letter to schools and youth groups advising them that he posed a risk to children. Despite those warnings, Bob Higgins continued to work in football until very recently, leaving one former Southampton manager to question if more could have been done to bar him from working in the sport.
There was always rumours going around about him. I think certainly at that time and after that time there was always talk. If I'd have got a letter as a manager of a football club and someone had given me a letter saying that he's a risk to children, I certainly wouldn't have been having him anywhere near a football club that I manage, that's for sure. But I certainly think the FA could have done certainly a bit more to monitor him and make sure that he wasn't allowed back into football.
Bob Higgins has always denied allegations of abuse. Meanwhile, the Football Association has announced the terms of reference for its own internal review into abuse within the game. It will now be led by Clive Sheldon QC and will review the period from the early 1970s up to 2005. The FA says it is committed to full disclosure of the review's findings, subject to any legal restrictions, stating it will examine any failings and what lessons can be learned. Richard Conway, BBC News.
The government wants to strip Network Rail of complete control of railway tracks in England. The Transport Secretary Chris Grayling wants the publicly owned company and train operators to share responsibility for running the tracks. He said it would lead to more reliable services and a better experience for passengers. At the moment, Network Rail runs the track and private companies run the trains. But unions say it could affect safety. Our transport correspondent Richard Westcott reports.
Fares are going up, punctuality's going down, and passengers are often unhappy with their service.
The amount of trains is not enough. There's only one train every hour from here to Manchester. My train in the morning is always late, but it's not late by too much.
If I had to pay as a pensioner, I really would be struggling.
Now the government says it's got a plan to cut delays. At the moment, Network Rail runs the track and private companies run the trains. The problem is, when things need repairing, both sides often disagree about who's responsible and how to fix it.
At the moment, we've got a situation where we've got different companies, often talking different languages, doing different things, not speaking to each other properly, throwing contracts around if things go wrong. This is all about changing that. It's about evolving into a teamwork structure into the front line of our railways so that the train operators, the infrastructure teams work hand in glove to deliver a better outcome for the passenger.
Luton Station's going to be right at the heart of these changes because the East Midlands line is going to be one of the first to try them out. But they won't start until 2018, so it's going to be some time before passengers notice any kind of difference. In a unique experiment, the government also wants a private company, not Network Rail, to build and run a line between Oxford and Cambridge.
It's come out of the blue, no discussion with ourselves, no discussion with Network Rail as far as I can tell. Certainly with us and Network Rail are a slippery slope to the breakup and privatisation of Network Rail and taking us back to the bad old days of rail track, you know, when we had a whole host of problems where the profit was put before safety.
Joint teams with Network Rail and train companies aren't new. They tried it on South West trains with mixed results, and they're giving it a go in Scotland, where punctuality is coming under fire from passengers. So big changes down the line, but it's still unclear how well it'll work. Richard Westcott, BBC News, Luton.
The time is 19 minutes past 1. Our top story this lunchtime. The man in charge of Brexit talks for the EU has signalled that he'll drive a hard bargain. There'll be no picking and choosing on issues like the single market. And still to come, why the number of women giving birth by caesarean section is having an impact on human evolution.
In South Today at 1:30, from smartphone to doctor's surgery, how an app can monitor patients at risk of heart attacks and strokes, and why drivers in Dorset are fuming over parking charges at local parks.
Now, a major international study has found that the UK's teenagers are continuing to lag behind pupils in other countries when it comes to science, maths and reading. In the tests known as PISA, Britain is outperformed by Singapore, Hong Kong and Japan, but also by Vietnam, Poland and Estonia. The survey is based on tests taken by more than 500,000 children in 72 countries. Our education correspondent Gillian Hargreaves reports.
The GCSE chemistry pupils at Genogly Academy in Nottingham know very well that what you put into something has a direct bearing on what comes out. This school is raising standards through sheer hard work and effort.
I want to be a physicist, so I want to focus on my own effort into my favourite subject, and I want to focus on myself rather than other people.
It's just about being able to just work hard and just being dedicated and just not giving up, really.
But today's report says too many schools in the UK are struggling because they cannot recruit good quality teachers.
Despite national adverts, despite putting more money to the posts, we still struggle to attract high quality teachers. It's a tough job, however it's a very rewarding job, but the picture is only getting worse.
So you'll have your 10 centimetres cubed of sodium.
Mindful of its place in the international league tables, the Westminster government has announced £12 million will be spent on helping science teachers get better at the job.
In a few years' time, these 15-year-olds will be entering the world of work. And while there are plenty of good quality science jobs in Nottingham, the fact is they'll be competing with candidates from all over the world. It's vital they have the very best skills to be able to hold their own.
In maths, the UK is ranked 27th in the world, down one place from 3 years ago. In reading, it's ranked 22nd, a modest improvement up from 23rd place in 2012. The UK's most successful subject is science, from 21st place to 15th.
Yeah, opposites seems like the
At
best you
Bishop
could say
Headley
that.
School in Merthyr Tydfil, they're trying new ways to teach to help raise standards. Yet again, Wales has the lowest results in every subject.
So what's a gecko?
Northern Ireland's rankings are broadly similar to 3 years ago, and the same is true in Scotland. The man who devised the league table said Britain risks losing out in the fight for jobs.
Skills affect people's attitudes, expectations, but also their opportunities in a global community in decisive ways.
And then we have
Singapore scores higher than any other nation, but critics say cultural differences mean schools are more authoritarian. Children work longer hours at the expense of creative thinking. Gillian Hargreaves, BBC News.
And you can see the full global education rankings on our website, and that's at bbc.co.uk/news. Just click on the Education tab at the top of the page. A man's been found guilty of supplying money to the Brussels bombing suspect dubbed the Man in the Hat. Zakaria Boufassil gave £3,000 to Mohamed Abrini. Well, our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Samford is at Kingston Crown Court for us now. Daniel.
Yes, Rita, the case here at Kingston Crown Court was quite a straightforward one. A man caught supplying money to terrorists. But the wider case is much more significant because the money went straight to the so-called Islamic State group responsible for the Paris and Brussels attacks. And the money came from British benefits being paid to a Belgian couple living in Syria. The carnage of the attacks in Paris in November last year, when gunmen supporting so-called Islamic State murdered 130 people. In March this year, 32 more were killed in Brussels by suicide bombers.
Okay, I go.
Both attacks are linked to the same IS commander, Abdelhamid Abayoud, who died in a raid in Paris, and to his suspected logistics man and courier, Mohamed Abrini, the infamous man in the hat seen during the Brussels airport attack. He visited Britain 4 months before the attacks and collected cash for Abayoud from two members of an IS cell in Birmingham, Mohammed Ali Ahmed and Zakaria Boufassil, who was today found guilty of funding terrorism.
Abayoud has tasked Abrini to come to the UK to recover cash from associates in Birmingham and take that back into Europe to support their efforts.
On this secluded pathway, Zakaria Boufasil handed Mohamed Abrini at least £3,000 in cash. Money that the Birmingham cell had raised through benefit fraud. Money that had come from the British state and was being used to fund so-called Islamic State. The benefits were collected using this house where two members of the cell had lived before leaving for Syria in September 2014. But after they'd gone, the couple, who were Belgian, were still having their housing benefit and child benefit paid into their British bank account month after month. They raised almost £10,000 in the year after they left. This was then withdrawn by those left behind in Birmingham and may have been used to fund the Paris and Brussels attacks.
The idea that benefit fraud could be used to fund terrorist activity is immensely serious, and I think we need a full investigation into this case and how it could possibly happen.
While Abrini, the man in the hat, was in the UK, he also took a series of photographs of, among other things, a church and a shopping centre in Birmingham and the Old Trafford Stadium in Manchester, which begs the question, was he also planning IS attacks in Britain? Mohamed Abrini was seen at a petrol station en route to the Paris attacks and at the airport during the Brussels attacks. Now in jail in Belgium, he's never fully explained the pictures he took in Britain of what could be seen as terrorist targets. The man in the hat has been questioned on behalf of British police about those photographs found on his phone, but he does insist there was no plan to attack Britain. Rita.
Daniel, thank you. Daniel Sanford there. Scientists say the regular use of caesarean sections is having an impact on human evolution. A study from the University of Vienna says the procedure has led to a rise in the number of women who need surgery to deliver a baby because their pelvis is too narrow. In the past, these genes would not have been passed down because women and their babies would have died in labour. Well, our correspondent Helen Briggs is with me now. And Helen, just explain a little bit more about why scientists think this is happening.
Well, caesarean sections started being used in the 1950s. They're now widely available for mums-to-be. So the scientists wanted to see if that had an impact on human evolution. So they looked at cases of what's called obstructed labour. That's just where a baby literally can't fit through the mother's pelvis. And they found that that has gone up. So before the advent of caesareans, or before they were widely available, it was about 30 cases in 1,000. Now it's gone up to 36. So that is a slight rise, and they think it is down to human evolution. Now, we should point out it is a surprise. There are some caveats here. We don't know definitely it's happening. This is a theory. It's modelling work based on data, and it could be due to reasons other than biology, because caesareans are rising quite a lot. If it is happening, though, then this trend may increase slightly, but the scientists say they can't see a day when all women will need caesareans to deliver.
OK, Helen, thank you. Now, with cheaper manufacturing costs in China and India, the UK's textiles industry has been facing steady decline over the past 30 years. In fact, figures show the number of jobs within the industry has fallen from 850,000 to just 85,000. But could things be about to change? Steph McGovern reports.
They've been making knitwear here in Derbyshire for over 220 years.
I've worked here now for over 20 years. There's been more increase in work, more people coming in, more machinery coming in. I feel our job security now is quite safe. John Smedley is now on the up and up and feel quite confident.
This is just one of the 95 textile manufacturers that we spoke to about how they're feeling about their business. And of those, 45% said that they've seen growth of 25% or more in the last year. Also, 30% told us that since the EU referendum, they have seen their inquiries increase since then. The big challenge for them, though, is skills and getting the right skills. 47% say that that is what they think is their biggest barrier to growth.
Well, I work with a lot of manufacturers and they're in much demand at the moment, particularly from the retailers. Some of them say to me they could triple their business tomorrow if only they could find the machinists and the skills to work in their factories.
The government say they're committed to skills development, apprenticeships and matching job seekers with vacancies. But the industry agrees it also needs to take on more training itself.
We need to see heavy investment both from the retail industry and ourselves in the manufacturing industry
I would suggest, particularly on apprentices.
It's not just about skills though. Manufacturers are still facing cost pressures from overseas competitors.
I think there's an absolute desire for the British customer to buy British goods, but we've got to make it affordable and we've got to keep the quality levels up.
This business is optimistic about the future of British textiles, but like others, it says the growth will only come from filling the skills gap and making sure retailers and manufacturers work together so the industry doesn't come apart at the seams. Steph McGovern, BBC News, Derbyshire.
Time for a look at the weather now. Here's Stav Danail. Stav.
Thank you very much, Rita. Well, it's been a chilly and a very foggy start across much of England and Wales. Really dense patches in places like this picture shows in Staffordshire and across Scotland as well. It's been another cold and in places frosty starts as well, like this picture depicts here in Rosehall in Highland. But we're going to see the back of the cold, frosty mornings for many. We've got temperatures around freezing around the Moray Firth of Scotland. By Wednesday, look at this. Given some sunshine with that very mild air, we could be seeing values 16, maybe 17 Celsius. So the cold air being shunted its way northwards during Tuesday and on into Wednesday. Milder air spreading up from the south, and it's going to be with us for quite a while. But through this afternoon, much of the country will be quite gloomy with some fog, some low cloud. But notice tightly packed isobars across this northwest corner and a weather front. This is bringing rain to Northern Ireland and increasingly so to western Scotland. Those temperatures rising as well, those stronger winds. But still, eastern Scotland quite chilly, like I showed you there. Temperatures around freezing in places. And for England and Wales, we're holding on to a lot of low cloud, some of that fog lifting into low cloud and lingering on across eastern areas. Brightness really will be limited across East Anglia and Kent, and even here turning cloudier. Notice the temperatures, though, southwest England and Wales, we're into double figures already, so that milder air really showing its hand. Into the evening and overnight, it stays windy across northern and western parts of the country. Maybe gales and exposure across the far northwest with rain spreading to all of Scotland, but drier further south and east. And although we'll see maybe one or two chilly spots across the northeast corner of the country, it's going to be a very mild night. Frost-free for most, something we haven't seen since the 15th of November. Now, as we head on in towards Wednesday, it's going to be very windy. Scotland, Northern Ireland, gales and exposure again. Outbreaks of rain, that rain pushing its way further southeast through the day. But I think a good portion of it, England and Wales, should be dry. Some glimmers of brightness. And where we get that brightness, it's going to feel exceptionally mild with values like this. It's no wonder in some fern effect corners like the Moray Firth, we could see 17 Celsius. Band of rain pushes in towards Wales, northern England and the southwest during Wednesday evening and overnight. It's because of this weather front here, which will be trailing further southwest. It looks like we'll see another ripple of rain pushing in towards England and Wales during the course of Thursday. Notice tightly packed isobars again across the north of the UK. So here it's set to stay windy. A few showers here, but for England and Wales Thursday, rather cloudy. Outbreaks of rain, which will slowly clear away through the course of the afternoon. Temperatures very mild again, maybe a touch cooler across the north, but it's set to stay mild really for the rest of the week, Rita.
Thank you, Steph. A reminder now of our main story this lunchtime. The man in charge of Brexit talks for the EU has signalled that he'll drive a hard bargain. There'll be no picking and choosing on issues like the single market. Well, that's all from the BBC News at 1, so it's goodbye from me. And on BBC One, we can now join the BBC's news teams where you are. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.